Hey, how you doing, econ teachers? This is Jacob Clifford. Now, I made this video specifically for AP economics teachers for micro and macroeconomics. And if you don't teach AP, don't feel bad that I'm not giving you what you need. In fact, let me know what you want. So in the description right now, say, hey, I teach college prep or regular econ. I would like to see this. And so let me know what you want and I'll make that. But I know there's a lot of you who are AP econ teachers. And so let me jump into some helping you know what not to teach or areas you can speed up that aren't a big deal when it comes to the test. Let me preface this whole thing by saying I don't know what's on the test. All I do is look at statistics from previous years. So I go through the free responses and multiple choice questions, and actually in my teacher resources, if you have those, I organized all the different multiple choice questions on the test. There's 60 multiple choice test questions, and basically I find, okay, what unit is each question in, and what content? Like what specific topic are they trying to cover? And if you look at the statistics long enough, you can go back and can realize how often they ask certain things, and then you know how much time to spend on certain things. I don't know what's on the test. This is all my opinion. This is my opinion based on previous tests. And if they change it next year, I don't want a bunch of people coming to me and email me and be like, you know, you said not to spend time on this and it was on the test. Why did you do that? Ideally, you can teach everything. If you have the time, teach everything. If you have a year-long course to teach micro or the entire course, I mean, for microeconomics or a whole year to teach macro, that's ideal. And you can cover all the details and cover everything. But let's be honest, a lot of us have a semester course and you got to get moving. So you have to figure out, what am I not going to teach? Where can I cut some corners? So that's what I'm going to focus on in this video. And the last thing, keep in mind the exam's going to change anyway. So right now they're on hold, but they're going to change the AP test like they did with biology and chemistry and US history. And so there's a change coming. I've asked a lot of questions about, okay, what's it going to look like? They haven't said. So I'm basically sticking with what they've done in the past. And that's not changing the test yet. When they do make the change, they'll tell us, the consultants, the ones who train teachers, and we'll know, and they'll have 2 full years before there's any change to the test. So it won't be like this year they'll change the test on us. There'll be plenty of time to get ready for it. So let's start with macroeconomics. And if you have my teacher resources, you know I organized the course into 5 units, 5 different units. Now, Unit 1, the thing you have to spend some time on in Unit 1 is the production possibilities curve, what they started to put more on free responses. So spend time on that. Make sure kids understand it. And then the whole idea of comparative advantage with terms of trade. It's a free response. It's often a free response question. It's going to have 1 or 2 multiple choice questions on comparative advantage. The thing is, they don't ask a lot of questions on anything else in Unit 1. There's not that much other things. So you don't have to spend a lot of time on the economic system. So don't spend a lot of time talking about what communism is, what the free market system. I mean, tell them, here's what the free market system is. Here's capitalism. That's what we're going to be talking about, and then move on. You can, but keep in mind there's an opportunity cost. If you spend a lot of time doing a cool simulation to talk about the different economic systems, then you're going to miss out time on graphs and other concepts you have to cover. So just keep that in mind. For both micro and macro, don't spend a lot of time on economic systems. Like the factors of production, just know the definitions. For factor of production, boom, move on. Don't do any activity that drives home. They know the difference between them. They do need to know definitions a few times, like the AP test. Either last year or the previous year asked what's human capital, so they should know the definition of human capital and maybe factor payments, and things like that, or transfer payments. So make sure they know key definitions, but then once they get it, you move on. Also in Unit 1, don't spend a lot of time on elasticity. So if you do supply and demand, teach demand, supply. It shouldn't take you longer than 3 days in macroeconomics. Teach demand, supply, put them together. Here's a shortage, here's a surplus, here's equilibrium, here's how the curves shift, and get enough of that shifting practice that they're good, that you don't have to spend a lot of time on elasticity or ceilings and floors. I have not seen a question that asks about ceilings and floors on the AP test. It's cool to teach. It's great if you have more time to teach that idea of, if the government gets involved, it might mess up the market. But you go a lot more details in microeconomics, and they just don't need that in macro. They do need to know double shifts, though. So on the 2017 test, they said if demand goes up and supply goes up or something like that, the kids need to understand what happens when there's a double shift. And they're going to need shifting for aggregate demand anyway. So spend some time on that, but don't spend a lot of time on elasticity. Maybe say what inelastic, elastic is, and then move on. Don't do any of the equation stuff that you would do in microeconomics. Now, in macroeconomics Unit 2, you learn the basic definitions and key concepts, GDP, unemployment, inflation. Make sure to teach all that stuff. But when it comes to inflation and CPI, I don't spend a lot of time practice and re-practice. I just made a CPI video this last week, like 3 or 4 days ago, and I'd send my students home, try it, make sure you understand CPI, get it, understand the deflator, ask them a few questions, but don't spend a lot of time on it because it's 1 or 2 multiple choice questions. So get the idea of CPI, understand it, and then get moving again, because if they understand the key graphs in Unit 3 and Unit 4, they're better off than if they know the detailed calculation stuff back in Unit 2. Now, also in Unit 2, when you're talking about inflation, or sometimes later on in Unit 4, when you talk about money, you hear about something called the time value of money. It has to do with the present value and the future money, or future value of currency. So in other words, the idea of like, if I had $100 today, would I rather have $100 today or $110 a year from now? And it all depends on the interest rate. There's all these equations that have to go with it. I don't teach it at all. I know this might make some of you upset. I don't spend any time on it at all. And the reason why is it's just not that often on the test. In fact, the AP test last year had one question, a multiple choice questions on that. And it wasn't like a question that required the calculations and the math at all. They didn't need to know any of that stuff. They just need to understand the general idea. So I have taught the general idea of it. If the interest rate's 10% and you have $100 today, that's going to be $110 in the future, in a year from now. So that concept students need to know, but all the equations that go with it, and if you have worksheets with the practice, all those equations, it's just not asked that very often in the test. In Unit 3, which is aggregate demand and fiscal policy, teach everything. You got to cover it all, because that's where the bulk of the AP test is in Unit 3 for macroeconomics. There is one thing that used to be on the AP test like 10 years ago, but it's not there anymore. So if you have a really old textbook, you might see it. It's the aggregate expenditures model, sometimes called the Keynesian cross. It's basically this graph right here, the Keynesian cross. It's not on the AP test at all. The concepts are, like the idea of the marginal propensity to consume and save and the 4 components of GDP. Those are all inside the AP test, but the actual graph that Keynes came up with is not. So don't teach that. And if you have a modern book, like a book that's been written in the last 5 years, it's not going to have any of that stuff in there anyway. So it's only for people who are using old resources. And that's why you don't use like the AP test from like 1995. Or 90 or 2000. Use more recent AP tests. Also, in Unit 3 and part of Unit 4, you don't have to spend a lot of time on economic thinkers. Like your book might have like a chapter on who the different economic thinkers and who came up with different ideas, and Chicago School of Economics and the monetarists and all that stuff. I don't spend any time on that at all. I know some teachers do. I talk about very general. Here's the Austrian view of economics, but it's not on the AP test, so keep that in mind. Maybe it's good to teach it, or some people give a project where students have to research these different schools of economic thought. All that stuff is all driving towards understanding the content. So if you're in other words, don't test on what did Milton Friedman believe and what is the views of Karl Marx, or like don't spend time testing that, because that's not what's on the AP test. So your test and the AP test should align, really well. And then in Unit 5, the whole idea of exchange rate regimes, when one government, usually a government, kind of manipulates the currency to keep the depreciated currency or something like that. The concept might be in the AP test. They don't spend a lot of time on it though. So, teach exchange rates, teach the balance of payments, make sure they get that stuff in Unit 5, but you don't do a lot of details. And if you're not sure what to teach, look at the AP test. I mean, new teachers come to me all the time, okay, I'm not sure what to teach. But look, go take an AP test. Sit down, take an AP test. And if you can answer the questions, then you're teaching at the level that students need to know. If you can't, you're like, I have no idea what this stuff is, you have to go a level down into the depth. So that's really where you want to focus on. Look at the old fair responses. Look at the multiple choice questions. If you haven't seen my website, ACDC Econ, I did a breakdown of all the fair responses they've given in like the last 10 years and told you what topic each fair response was on. So one, it's good to go find those fair responses. So if you're looking for something for Unit 3, you can go find it by topic. And two, you can look how often they ask those sort of questions, and you can see how much time you have to spend on it in your classroom. So that's macroeconomics. If you disagree with anything that I said, let me know in the comments below. Or if you have questions about anything, let me know in the comments below. Now, for you micro teachers, keep in mind some of the same things are at play. In Unit 1, do not spend a lot of time talking about the economic system. So don't jump in to the whole idea of communism and spend a lot of time talking about the free market and capitalism. Don't spend more. In other words, don't spend more than like a quarter of a lesson on just here's what it is, here's the concept, and move on. In college prep, I spend a day or 2 days of watching econ movies in class, where I talk about the whole idea of economic systems and how there's a mixed economy. You just don't have time for that in microeconomics, because you're going to be talking about the free market system for the rest of the course. So basically, introduce it, show the circular flow, and then move on. Good news in Unit 1 for micro teachers is the AP test hasn't asked a comparative advantage question in the fair responses. In other words, you can speed up comparative advantage. I teach my students, okay, here's the output method, get it, here's the input method just in case, and then we're moving on because they haven't done a fair response. There is 1 or 2 multiple choice questions, so keep that in mind. You are students, if you never teach comparative advantage, students might miss those 2 questions, but then what other things can you teach if you have the time? So keep that in mind, and I've never seen a terms of, I have seen a terms of trade question, but they're not asked very often. So understand the general idea of comparative advantage, teach them the idea of the quick and dirty, help them understand the idea, have them do the practice video that I just made last week for comparative advantage, and then get moving pretty quick. For Unit 2, elasticity is super important, so spend time calculating the income and cross-price elasticity, understanding how to calculate demand elasticity and supply elasticity. Last couple of years, they put in some supply elasticity, so make sure students have done elasticity. But I don't teach the midpoint formula at all. I know some teachers do, and if you have the time or really mathy kind of kids, it works for them. I don't do the midpoint formula. I do for elasticity of demand, just percent change in quantity divided by the percent change in price. That's the equation they need to use, and that's it. And I don't spend a lot of time on it. If the kids are totally they totally get it, then maybe I'll give them a little more details. But if most of my students are just regular students, right? A lot of them are taking AP for the first time, and so I don't have these huge expectations when it comes to math. So your students might be different. For my students, I don't do the midpoint formula. I used to do some skipping through consumer choice back in Unit 2, where you have margin utility to calculate margin utility per dollar, and then figure out which how many of each different product people should buy. That has been on free responses, and they keep putting it on free responses. So spend time in Unit 2 talking about margin utility. It's kind of separate because you got supply and demand and consumer surplus and ceilings and floors and all that stuff in taxes in Unit 2. And then you have this extra consumer choice theory stuff on the side that doesn't really fit exactly in there because there's no kind of graph. But make sure you teach it. Consumer choice, calculating margin utility, and figuring out how many units you should buy of stuff. In Unit 3, that's the bulk of perfect competition and cost production. You got to teach everything pretty much in there. Make sure you cover economies of scale. There'll be 1 or 2 questions on that. There's some places you can't skip. Unit 3 is where you just can't skip at all. Unit 4, you don't have to teach the kink demand curve. The kink demand curve has never been on the AP test. The concept of competing oligopoly firms is on there. Like if I price high, and then you'll just ignore my higher price and keep your price the same. That concept might be there, but they don't have to actually draw the graph. So I would never put on a free response or on my test, draw the kink demand curve as an actual question. I might show it to the student. So sometimes what I'll do, and this applies to macro too, I'll write a note, I did not cover this, and I'll cover it when we review for the AP test. The reason why is students have a tendency to oh man, they start getting bogged down in some of the details in the unit, and you start losing them. So I go, listen, instead of getting them bogged down, I'll hold it until they've learned enough to where I reintroduce it before we review for the AP test, because okay, I see the connection there. So kink demand curve you can speed up. In Unit 5, you make sure they've seen the monopsony and understand how to figure out the wage and the quantity of workers hired, but don't spend a lot of time drawing it. It's the other perfect competition side-by-side graphs that's way more important. Unions, you don't spend a lot of time on unions. I've never seen a question on unions. Your book might have a page talk about what unions are and where they came from in the history of unions. None of that stuff's on the AP test, even though it is in my state requirements. It's not on the AP test. I don't teach the Gini coefficient. I know some people might not like that. I show them the Lorenz curve. Here's what it is. Here's the concept. But I don't spend any time on the Gini coefficient because it's just not that often on the test. So I don't really teach it. And I don't spend very much time talking about environmental economics. I talk about negative and positive externalities, but I don't spend a lot of time talking about cap and trade and other things you would see in a full environmental economics class. If you have my teacher resources, go to where it says practice exams. In that folder, it'll tell you a breakdown of the multiple choice questions. And just look, if they haven't asked a multiple choice question in 5 years on something, then don't spend a lot of time on it. If they ask 5 questions, then spend time on it. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. Again, leave a comment, subscribe. Please tell other teachers about this channel. Thanks for watching. Until next time.